That's the sad part. Dear friends, can we also so much have so much
Good afternoon. Thanks for being here with us. I'm really pleased to get to welcome you and introduce our guest speaker today. I'll make a request. This is a small room. If you could silence your phones, put them away, give us your full attention. So I'm really happy to be up here introducing my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Hans Bruyninckx. He and I went to graduate school together 1,000,000 years ago. We went to Colorado State University. So I can tell you quite a bit about that stage of his life, lots of stories. But he has gone on to do really great things since grad school, unlike me. And he worked for many years in academia, and he taught at a number of universities in Europe, most notably, I think, Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And then he went to go work for the EU, and he was the executive director of the European Environment Agency for 10 years, during which time he was really involved in, I think, all aspects of what was happening in the EU, global negotiations, including the COP and the UNFCCC. We are co-leading a workshop tomorrow on the COP, so if you're here today, we would love to see you back again tomorrow at noon for more depth on the COP and what goes on inside the negotiations. For now, I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Bruyninckx, and he will walk us through the European Green Deal. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. First of all, thanks to the Climate School for inviting me for this talk. What I will try to do is to walk you through the main components of the current European ambitions on climate, but I will not focus on walking you through endless legal texts and nitty-gritty details. What I think is much more important is to understand the logic of those ambitions in Europe and the context in which they are framed. And that's also why I focus on the Green Deal, because I don't think you can understand European climate ambitions without understanding the broader picture of the Green Deal. As you notice, I'm not a native speaker. There will be Q&A, but if I speak gibberish and you don't understand words that I use because they don't sound like real words, there's a high likelihood that they are not real words. You can tell me and I will try to explain what they mean. Okay, good. This should work. No, it doesn't. That's okay. No. Okay. Okay, that's lesson number one. Technology alone is not the solution. That's an important lesson in climate change issues. Okay, here we are. Okay, great. Okay, great. I'm in the climate school, so you know what this is. The climate is getting hotter. Okay. To understand European climate ambitions and the way we deal with them, you also need to understand this one. And this is, the grayer it gets, the less biodiversity we have. Yeah, you can get a tie that has this curve on it. I mean, some people like to wear it. I don't. Here you can't get a tie, so you just got a free business idea. But the thing is, of course, that in the last 10 to 15 years, we understand that these are closely interconnected. And that is an essential part of understanding European climate ambitions. But to zoom out a bit, whatever we do in Europe is based in global scientific assessment reports that bring science to policy. And of course, you're all familiar with the IPCC. I hope that you're all familiar with the IPBES as well, which is making that connection. You are probably less familiar with the International Resource Panel, which is a similar panel that works on how we use resources in the global economy, systems of production and consumption, and how that has an impact on the other elements. Yeah. And we just did a global report, Bend the Trend, that speaks a lot about climate change and biodiversity and human health. That's the link with the World Health Organization's work, and I was the lead author of the report. So the linkages that are embedded in it, I can address as well. All these reports say the same thing. It's the pivotal decade. You wouldn't tell if you look at the policies we're framing in many places. We are already living in a time of irreversibilities, which is much more profound than just stating it, I think. We are looking at tipping points in Earth systems, but I would argue also tipping points in social systems, and therefore in socio-ecological systems, and these things are interconnected. What is very typical for the discussion in Europe at the moment is that there is a lot of attention going to the social dimension. So what are the distributional aspects of addressing this triple planetary crisis? To what extent can we frame this as a just transition, not as a slogan? That's easy. What do we want? Just transition. Okay, but what does it mean then in policy terminology? But also the social acceptance of responses. And those are important issues. We all know the global response to this triple planetary crisis. It's the SDGs. It's about the only global policy program that we still all somehow recognize. People wear the pin with the 17 colors, whether you're an NGO person, an academic, or a public official. And that also gives opportunity in my critical mind of the greenwashers now becoming rainbow washers. But that's another issue. I mentioned again, because we had SDGs already in 1992 at the Rio Summit. It was called Agenda 21. Yeah, if you modernize the language, you add the new scientific sauce on top of it, it's the same thing. We're less sustainable now than in 92. So the question is now, what are we going to do essentially different in the next 30 years, which apparently we haven't done in the previous 30 years. Yeah. Okay. So I stylized this in this way. The last 60 years, we've seen an incredible institutionalization of an agenda of climate, environment, sustainability. That's present everywhere in all countries now, also in the international scene. Climate focus, especially the noughties, then SDGs, triple planetary crisis as a framing. If you look at the impact of that on Earth systems, that is the impact on Earth systems. If you're a really poor statistician, you would say, by all means, let's get rid of all these institutions because they seem to be bad for the planet. There are seats here. Yes, welcome. Okay. Good. Yeah. But if you're not a bad statistician, this begs for a serious academic set of questions. If this is the result of 60 years of building institutions, what has gone wrong? Now, some people say it would be worse if we would not have done it. It's the counterfactual reasoning. I have no idea why some academics spend half of their career on proving that it could be worse. It's not exactly what gets me out of bed in the morning to do my job. Then there is a whole bunch of people who focus on implementation gap, better regulation, and institutional design. That's the biggest name there is probably Oren Young and the people working with him. All the attention is on institutions. Yeah, you can read most of that monumental work domain without learning anything about the environment or climate or anything about systems of production and consumption. It's about institutions. Some say there is a time lag effect, the environmental Kuznets curve crowd. The Kuznets curve is not a reality except for industrial pollution. It's not talking about impact on the planet as a whole. But if that's not the case, then what is the real issue? Well, the conclusion that we with the European Environment Agency have drawn is that most of these institutions do not address the fundamental unsustainability of our systems of production and consumption. Yeah? They are all based in the dominant paradigm, which is optimization, yeah, and efficiency gains. Don't question the basics, make them more efficient and optimize them. And an engineer will say that's increasingly difficult from a technology perspective, and an economist will say that's increasingly expensive because the marginal efficiency gains become more and more expensive. So, okay, but anyway, we need to address this. Of course, climate diplomacy is a good example of that. This is when we started to negotiate climate change. You see the incredible results of institutional approaches. They're not working. It's a serious point. I have a daughter who is 17. We've been discussing climate change for 34 years, twice her age. And when she asked me, what are the results? Well, 60% more emissions, yeah? Okay. This is the best you can do. So the whole idea of the Green Deal and of climate change policies in Europe is that we need to focus on the most resource and energy intensive systems that provide for society, and that is the food system, the energy system, the mobility system, and the built environment. And we need to rethink and reconfigure them at system level, not at the level of fragmented approaches and not at the level of efficiency gains. Yeah? Okay, so the European response to the triple planetary crisis was the European Green Deal, yeah? Formulated early 2020. And to illustrate to you how much of a potential paradigm shift this was considered to be, in European policy making, the emphasis was always either on growth and jobs, when it was a center-right coalition, or on jobs and growth, when it was a center-left coalition. Yeah? I mean, that's how the policies were framed. This was the first time when actually the sort of boundary condition for the European performance of economy and society was framed as planetary boundary conditions. Yeah? So these are the intertwined goals. First of all, becoming the first climate neutral continent. I will say a lot more about that. Biodiversity strategy that was responding to scientific evidence that, we needed to deal with the sixth great extinction and provide for natural capital in a serious way. A circular economy action plan, which is focusing on resource efficiency in our economy. A zero pollution strategy, zero pollution meaning no pollution that is hurting human health or environmental health. Yeah, very tall order. Farm to fork strategy, the first time that Europe did not have a narrow-minded approach to agriculture, but placing it in a food system approach. Yeah, very audacious and in the end, until now, not terribly successful, I have to say. Just transition, first time that we made a connection between a social agenda and an agenda on environment and climate. Intellectually very challenging because those two fields of study are taking place in very different domains of most knowledge institutions, including most universities. An investment plan that goes to an investment strategy beyond we need more money for stuff. Yeah, I'll explain that a bit. And then an industrial strategy. But if you read through all of these, climate change actually goes through all of them. Yeah, so you cannot understand this if you have no concept of the others. And the way to do it, the approach, is framed in there. Europe must lead the transition. And transition is a word that has meaning. It comes from the field of transition science, yeah, systemic transitions. There's a whole research community around that that is mostly European, but increasingly also finds its bearings in a North American context. Okay, just a couple of basic numbers. Europe is emitting about 6% of the global emissions today. So this is a big discussion. Why should we lead when we're only 6% of the emissions? Okay, in my opinion, that's a really strange question. I'll try to explain why. We have already, in 22, we had achieved 31% emission reductions compared to 1990, the reference year in climate change, and we set a target for minus 55% for 2030. Okay, those are some of the basics. You know this curve, of course. it is the curve of temperature, average temperature on Earth. You can see that 23 and 24 were truly exceptional years. Climate acceleration, climate modelers are trying to sort out what is happening. But Europe is heating up twice as fast as the average. So we are in a way hit by the consequences sooner, yeah? And you see that primarily in the high north, but also around the Mediterranean, which is a really important area for Europe culturally, historically, but also for agriculture, for tourism, for all of that. The same is true for sea temperature. Again, see the anomaly in 23 and 24, which is very significant. Also here, European waters, and we always say half of the territory of Europe is water, is the marine environment. Half, yeah. We're mammals, of course, so we're focused on land, but there's a lot of ocean out there, where the hottest years are in the last 2-3 years. So big impact from climate change, bigger than in other places. Typical for Europe is also the focus on the role of glaciers. Austria in this case, but also Switzerland. The glaciers might disappear in its functional contribution to the freshwater cycle by mid-century. And you could say, yeah, that's sad for the skiers and for all of that, but these glaciers and the Alps are the origin of the Rhine River, the Danube River, the Po River, the Inn River, and I could go on. So this is absolutely critical for Europe. So this is where we are today in Europe, heat waves. This is the Rhine River, where we had to reduce the payload on ships by 30% 2 summers ago because there was not enough water, and it's an artery of the economy. This is not Niger, this is France, and these are the forest fires in Portugal. And then our politicians and lay people would say, oh, what an exceptional summer we had. As scientists, we said, no. First of all, it's not exceptional because get used to it. This is the new normal, and it's in 30 years, we will say those were mild summers. And you've seen these pictures. We've shown them to you 10 years ago. This is what they looked like. Yeah, it's called science. And I can show you pictures now for the end of the century or 2050. And then you can put your pictures on top of that. So this is science. We knew what was coming statistically on average. Yeah. Okay. What it also means is that we are increasingly looking at a sort of transition from extreme weather events to extreme societal events. The huge floods in Central Europe that moved then to Italy and to the Balkan region, that is not an extreme weather event. It's an extreme societal event. You could compare it to what you just saw in Florida and the Carolinas and Georgia. I mean, that is not just an extreme weather event. Yeah, if the insurance companies take their hands off of insuring houses in Florida, which the biggest insurance companies are now doing, is that an extreme weather event? No, it's shifting the balance in many other ways. So this is really important. Yeah. Okay, good. Now, we need to deal with this in what we call the VUCA world. I assume you're familiar with that, a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous reality, which makes policy making politically very difficult. And of course, in Europe, this is what this world looks like. Inflation, you've had the same issues here. We are looking at new alliances geopolitically that are forming. We have wars in Europe and at the borders of Europe. We have big banks that go belly up, which was, not so conceivable. We had COVID, so this is what it looks like. And to show the ambiguity of the reality, in the year 22-23, the big oil companies made unbelievable profits off of the fossil fuel economy, yeah? Like the Aramco of Saudi Arabia, 161 billion net income in 22. At the same time, we're struggling to get a $100 billion climate fund together. By the way, this was devaluated in Copenhagen immediately by 25% because when the US government walked in and gave a press conference at the COP in Copenhagen, we were still speaking about 100 billion euros. And in the press conference, it was announced that it was $100 billion. So minus 25% on the spot. You know, the difference is not as big today and all, but I mean, make it really, yeah, bizarre world, yeah. Europe has weaned itself in about a year from Russian gas, but we now get it from Qatar. If you look at the European Treaty on Human Rights, which is part of the European, it's ambiguous. Is really Qatar the type of country that I mean, there are other issues there that some people contest, yeah? And of course, we could save 1 trillion in fossil fuel costs if we would go green in our energy system. And this is not coming from a green NGO, it's the World Economic Forum. And yet, it's not happening. I mean, it is happening partially. So, I mean, it's ambiguous. What on earth is happening? And then, of course, we're all dealing with populists. And when I say all, you know, we're all dealing with populists. Yeah. And we know from research that populists are not good for the agenda that I'm speaking to. There's good research on that. We are surrounded by fake news, also climate change. We still live in a world where Oxfam can write a yearly report on the richest 62 people on the planet that have as much as 3.6 billion poorest people. I mean, that doesn't really facilitate global governance on these issues. And we're, of course, living in times of this American investigative journalism book called Stuffocation. Yeah, we're living in times of stuffocation. So in that context, that happy context, we need to get to net zero. But the Earth system is also giving us increasingly uncertainty. I will not get into that because I'm in the climate school. There is no reason to do that. But these tipping points are increasingly part of the discussion, and especially the Atlantic thermohaline circulation, because that is incredibly important for Europe. Yeah, if you look at where we are on the latitude, if that stops functioning, we have a serious issue. Okay. To make things more complicated, you've heard of wicked problems as a framing. That is now often used. By the way, it was framed in 1973, 1 year after the 1972 Stockholm conference by Richter and other scientists. So it's old. What is newer is the thinking about super wicked problems by Ben Cashore from Yale University previously. He's now at NUS in Singapore and other colleagues of his. And they say that what is added to wicked problems is that time is running out. And I think that's the signal we're getting from a lot of our climate modeling colleagues. Policies discount the future irrationally. We are so trained to think in linear processes, but we're now entering a stage of tipping points and of thresholds. So our sort of linear thinking doesn't really hold. And that is very difficult to deal with as society and as policymakers. This is France. It's a winter drought. If I would have said 10 years ago that France would have a winter drought, they would have gently taken me off the podium and into a mental institution. So, I mean, things are changing in ways that we are not used to thinking along these ways. Yeah? Okay, so those seeking to solve the problem are also causing it. These are the private jets in Davos. Yeah, I knew you were gonna laugh, but it's serious business because who is meeting there annually? The top of the energy system, the top of the mobility system, the top of the material system, the top of the chemical system, the top of the financial system, and the top of the governance system. And it's easy to say, you know, we don't need these guys, they are the bad guys and they're mostly guys, yeah? We don't need them, but no, we do need quite a number of them, because I'm sympathetic to the bottom-up thing. In fact, I'm involved in some bottom-up work because I like to do it. But you're not going to roll out a functional renewable energy system with bottom-up initiatives. You need big investments, big companies, technology. I mean, so we need them, yeah? Not all of them, and not in the same way. But I mean, this is a really tricky issue, yeah? And then, of course, there's no central authority. And you recognize this place. It's on, what is it, 42nd Street here, the United Nations, which you can hardly call an authority today, if it ever was, yeah? Okay, so in that context, and I know I took a long time explaining the context, but I think it's important because policies don't fall from the sky. We framed a European climate law, and European climate law, in essence, puts in a legal text that is binding that we will be climate neutral by 2050, yeah, period, yeah? Now, climate neutrality in Europe means that we will have about 10% emissions left, 10 to 15%, because you cannot get rid of all of them. And we will compensate in two ways: natural systems, the natural carbon cycle, and by technology. Yeah, that's carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use. That's what we will do. It means that we will have an energy system that is almost completely decarbonized. We will have an industry and building sector almost completely decarbonized, transport almost completely decarbonized, yeah, in less than 30 years. Huh? Less than 30, we have 26 years left. The biggest part is the agricultural sector, because that's hard to abate, especially given some cultural assumptions we make. Voilà. You see an increase in the natural systems. That's a very optimistic assumption, because today we see an inverse relationship. Yeah. So that is the link with the ecosystem part of it, which I will mention. Yeah. You see an increase in the rate of mitigation measures. It means a tripling of the efforts per year compared to the period 1990 to 2020. Tripling of the efforts. Yeah. Okay, so if this is the goal, you need a package of measures. And the first package, legally binding, was what we call the Fit for 55, because by 2030, we will have 55% less emissions. That is the goal, yeah? Which means you need to work on your energy system. You need to work on the transport system, and we are now including aviation and the maritime sector. Yeah, I think Europe was setting the pace there. You need to work on taxation and trade issues, because those are setting incentive structures and framing also exchange with those areas outside of Europe, which is important. And you need to work with the system, the ETS, the emissions trading system, which is in essence a bubble principle, where the bubble gets smaller and the number of allowances is decreasing, and therefore there is competition and price set on carbon. But I assume that most of you know that. We have included maritime and aviation, and also now buildings are part of it, which is changing really a lot how we think about that part of the economy. So that has been translated mostly in legislation and will have to be implemented. Yeah, we're doing a lot of monitoring. I will not dwell into this, but those who said we're screaming bloody murder when we said minus 55%, they thought it was completely impossible. Well, we know that the 2030 target, this is the policy gap we have. So it's a small policy gap. Implementation will matter, but in principle, the policies that we framed should almost get us there. Yeah? The next stage will be much more difficult, because if we call that WHAM analysis with additional measures, yeah, will only get us there. So this is the real policy gap that we have, yeah? Which is why it was really important to frame a 2040 objective, which is part of the law. The law puts in motion put in motion a process to set a 2040 target. And for that, we have a scientific advisory body. It's called the EU Scientific Advisory Board for Climate Change. It's 15 scientists that are selected in Europe and that are embedded, but in an independent way, in European Environment Agency. And they talked about a target of minus 90%. Yeah. Now, if you claim that you're science-based, yeah, and that you have a rational approach, there was no way that the Commission, the European Commission, could dismiss that. So the Commission framed a proposal for minus 90% that made it through the Council, which is where the countries meet, and through the Parliament, but it still needs final approval. Now, that's where the political context in Europe is also changing and where things become more tricky. But when the scientists released their minus 90, they were ridiculed, yeah? Ridiculed by some political groups, but also by the public, like, yeah, come on, minus 55% in 2030, and then minus 90 in 2040. Are these people from a different planet? They're so stupid, they're disconnected from reality. No, they're applying the trend line that we have agreed, one. Secondly, this is in line with the Paris Agreement, which is in principle a legally binding international treaty. Yeah. So welcome to the world. You know, this is what you agreed to. So there was an iron logic behind that. Yeah. That's briefly the mitigation part. We also have an increased interest in adaptation. Yeah. And we frame that usually in impacts and risks first, and vulnerabilities. And that is, of course, based also on trends that we see in Europe in changes. And the European Environment Agency this year in 2024 wrote a really important and influential report. Yeah? The EUCRA, the European Climate Risk Assessment, which is the most extensive and integrated risk assessment that has been done anywhere on the planet on 6 big categories, yeah, infrastructure, health, also the financial system and stability of macroeconomic performance. So we really looked into different areas. And the general conclusion is we understand the risks better and better. We have national strategies that include some of them, but we are not implementing them and putting enough money and actual policy efforts into implementation. So important report. It focused on the vulnerability of our food system, which if you're from the Mediterranean area is already part of daily reality. It becomes an impossible region for some agricultural crops because of heat and water, but also things like the insurance companies. Yeah, the insurance sector is really important in this, and so this rang a bell. And it will be the basis for a legally binding initiative on climate adaptation also in Europe. This is very high on the books of the commissioner, Wopke Hoekstra, yeah, the Dutch commissioner who is working on that initiative. We're also making the link with health systems together with the Lancet and with a bunch of other institutions in Europe. The agency is running the European Climate and Health Observatory, where we are gathering more and more information on how climate change is impacting human health. And an anecdote there is 2 years ago, I was asked to give a talk to the European Cardiological Society. And I told them, I said, you are talking to the wrong guy because I don't know anything about the heart. Four big rooms, 2 valves, and a couple of tubes. I'm not your guy. I will ridicule myself. And they said, no, that's exactly why we want you, because we want to hear about climate change, temperature, humidity, stressful events that are happening, what is happening in our cities, urban heat islands, all of those things. So things are changing very quickly in this domain. Also, the link with mental health. So in Emilia-Romagna, in Italy, we had big floods. There are case studies now being developed that look at what impact did that have on mental health. So, I mean, these issues are important and they are part of an integral European approach to climate. It's not only mitigation, it's a much broader approach, yeah? When we make the link with resource use, I took one of the basic graphs of the International Resource Panel, yeah? What people don't realize is in the extraction and processing phase of raw materials, you already have 60% of the global climate change impacts. So if you don't need to use the raw materials because you keep the materials in the economic cycle, or you buy less stuff, yeah, for starters, that has a big impact. So it's not by focusing only on energy transitions without addressing these issues that you will get there. This is a critical message. Pollution, 40% of the health impacts through air pollution and biodiversity loss. We took land also as a resource, as a non-substitutable resource, and very easy, difficult to restore. So these messages are clear, and Europe is adding a lot of resource efficiency and circular economy issues to the mix. That goes into all sorts of things, again, EEA, circular economy and waste sector policies and measures, but linked to not only let's recycle better and reuse, but climate linkages. I'm trying to make all of those connections. On each slide, I could give a 2-hour class, but I want to introduce you to all the fingerprints of climate on everything. Nature restoration law. I don't know how well known that concept is here or that, okay. So we're no longer talking about nature protection, but active restoration of nature, which is completely in line with the Kunming-Montreal agenda, 30% by 2030, and we are not there. But also with this trend line of natural systems that capture more carbon. This is not happening now. So you need to focus on those systems like wetlands, bogs, that do that the best. And nature restoration, by the way, the term nature restoration was already mentioned in the final text of 1972 after the Stockholm Conference. So when this was introduced, again, they said, yeah, you've got these crazy scientists who are introducing these wild concepts. Are they sick in the head? No, we are not. Okay, then really critical is the Sustainable Finance Initiative in Europe, where we were finally, I would say at last, asking about the role of the financial system in these transitions and the role of investments. And we did 2 big things. First of all, a taxonomy was developed that is a sort of categorization of those investments which we consider to be aligned with the European Green Deal. Yeah? So if you want to make claims about sustainable investments or tap into money that is for sustainable investments, there is now a catalog of what that means. Big political discussions around that, especially with the French who wanted nuclear in there and with some others who wanted other stuff in there. Yeah, but we finalized that. The other big thing is to put additional regulation on the financial sector where they have to disclose in a fully transparent and formatted way their engagement with the sustainability agenda. It's the non-financial disclosure regulation. And there is now a collaboration between the European Environment Agency and the financial watchdogs in the European system. Imagine that your EPA would be working with your financial watchdog institutions. I don't think that is happening. That is happening now. Huh? Okay, why is that so important? Okay, this is why I'm glad I'm in the US. You guys are very clear about it. What's the name of your economic system? How do you label it? Capitalism. Yeah, it's capitalism. Yeah. We're a bit more soft-spoken. We call it the market economy. It's the same difference. There are fundamental differences in how we navigate the system, but capitalism. we want radically different outcomes in a system called capitalism, then you need to address the role of capital. And this is not a neo-Marxist statement, it's an analytical statement. So finally, we are addressing this, yeah? And I think it's about time that we did that. We also have a link with industry, with the Net Zero Industry Act. I will be very brief on that. It's hundreds of billions pouring into the industry in support of the agenda. It's a response to the IRA, yeah? I regret that. We should not have been responding to the IRA. The IRA should have been responding to us. No, I mean seriously, because we had the overall agenda, but we were late with this part of the agenda. But voilà, this is really important. It also includes, this, by the way, is not a Mendeleev table. It's a table of sustainable chemicals by Paul Anastas from Yale University, the grandfather of green chemistry. We now frame the chemicals for the future as safe and sustainable by design, because you need to go to the molecule level if you want to solve the climate issue. The current materials, the current molecules that we use in our economy are not compatible with biodiversity nor with climate objectives. I will not get into that because it's leading too far. And then the protest starts, yeah? Macron is wanting to push the pause button. He's followed by others like my own prime minister, because it's about time that we stop putting more and more legislation on this planetary stuff. Europe is suffering from competition and we have wars and energy prices and all of that, okay? So the pushing back ambitions is starting. Sustainability is again a luxury product, yeah? We slow down, we're protectionist, narrow interests. The dangerous ones are the ones that are saying it will be okay. We know that it's happening, it will be okay. That's where my scientific maps come in. We now know that it will not be okay, yeah? Or we are already doing a lot of things. Yeah, that's true. That's true, but it's apparently not bending the trend. Yeah, it's not bending the trend. Yeah, of course, the populists always chip in with whatever simplistic solutions they have to complex issues, and that feeds into the. I mean, every complex problem has a solution that is simple, fast, and cheap, and wrong. Yeah? And that's a bit how we frame that. But none of these hold in light of the systemic challenges that the planetary boundaries are facing. But Europe has been through parliamentary elections, and we now have our own anti-climate and anti-Green Deal people in the parliament and in quite a few countries. Yeah, and we are focusing more on competition. This is Draghi, yeah, previous Italian prime minister. He wrote a report on European competitiveness, where he says we should invest more on competitiveness in our industry to also lead and implement the Green Deal agenda, which is a nice link. Many of the more green people are, upset about that because it's now all competitiveness. But I think this is a reasonable intellectual challenge for us, because we have been claiming as a community for several years that actually good climate and environment policy is good economic policy. Well, this is the moment to work with connecting the dots there in a stronger way. What could be a longer term challenge that is not mentioned in the Draghi report is, this is from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Change, where they are connecting the best current modeling on macroeconomics and climate, and they come to the conclusion that global GDP could significantly decline by 2050. I'm getting the signal here that we're nearing the end, so I will skip this one. Voila. Some people say if we need to speed up and scale up, the data will do it. Yeah, I guess so. We can do a lot with data, but we're getting more and more, and then more data. The real question is, does it create more noise, or can we create better sound out of the data, to put it very simply, yeah? Then a couple of global things. Emissions overshoot. This is where people are impacted most. If you don't put this central to your worldview, forget it, yeah? This is from a resource perspective, the environmental debt of our resource use. High-income countries, upper middle, lower middle, low-income countries. The displacement is not to the middle-income countries, it's to the poorest countries. Again, if you don't put this central in a discussion, good luck. Climate justice, I will skip the discussion in the interest of time. It's a really simple slogan. What do we want? Climate justice. When do we want it? Now? Of course we want it now. But if you want to go into the details of it, it's a really tricky issue. You know, how do you legislate this? How do you implement that? What is fair? What is not fair? Justice is an essentially contested concept. So it's not easy. I will skip this. You can find all of that. This is an interesting one. Study to 2010, they looked at company emissions, and 90 companies in the world had 60% of the emissions. Yeah, 5 of the 20 are US companies, but the largest proportion are state-owned companies. Ambiguous. Is this the private sector or is it state-owned? I will leave it at that, but there's a lot of great work there. So we're on a steep and narrow path to sustainability. Yeah. This is actually a path in the Italian Dolomites. I sometimes wonder what happens when somebody is coming from the other side. Okay, anyway, why is it steep? Because we've wasted 30 years since Agenda 21, which means that all the curves that you see that lead to sustainability now have a steeper inclination. It needs to go faster. Why is it narrower? Because we have fewer options. Yeah, we have fewer options. So this is difficult. My last slide on optimism. You can be a techno-optimist with all the reflections on that. You can be a niche optimist. Oh, there's this great invention. Yeah, is it scalable? Will it go fast enough? It's always tricky to listen to those who have the panacea. An EU bubble optimism, which we suffer from in Europe, we're so ahead, and it's, you know, but we're not the world. Bottom-up optimism, I talked about that, but there is also optimism that is based in real numbers and in analysis, like renewable energy. The uptake is going faster than the International Energy Agency predicted. The materials revolution that is going on, and also the attention for the social dimension, which I find very important. But there is also another reason to be an optimist. Optimists live longer. Since I'm a scientist, this is based on a macro study of the American Geriatric Society, so it's based on research. Yeah. But on the final sentence will be, is optimism really the question? Because I'm often asked when I speak in more broader audiences, not specialists like yourself, so, Mr. Bruyninckx, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And I usually say I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I use the words of Jean Monnet, one of the founding fathers of the EU. When he was asked the question, he said, I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist. I'm determined. And that is my way of dealing with this reality, because I'm with my nose in these not so pleasant facts all day. So I cannot be a naive optimist, yeah? I can't be a pessimist because that is not helping too many people, and that's not a convincing language to motivate actors. So I try to be determined and to use my agency, not the European Environment Agency, because I only had the privilege of being the director there. It was not my agency, it's the public's agency, but my agency day to day of doing what I can do to be involved in this motivating European agenda. So thanks for your attention. I'm happy to take any question or remark or protest action or whatever it is. I'm at Columbia, so. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, with the change in the composition of the European Parliament, are there any real hurdles that you would want want to highlight to implementing the Green New Deal? What are the biggest barriers, the biggest changes to
Okay.
look out for?
Okay, well, the European Parliament, if you go from the left to the right, in terms of political spectrum, which I think is a bit outdated by now in many ways, but there are more people on the right, the extreme right, populist right, also a bit on the populist left, because I'm not myopically focusing on the right. There is populism on the left as well, which I find equally unhelpful, because equally simplistic to solve complex issues. So the workable space in the middle is smaller. And in the European Parliament, you always need to find new coalitions to get legislation through. Party lines are not as strict as in most countries. So there are a couple of groups that are split on issues, the Socialists and Democrats and the EPP, the Christian Democrats in particular. So you need to work with that. But beyond the parliament, I think what is obvious is that competitiveness issues play a lot, regardless of that parliamentary constellation. We have an energy issue in Europe because, I mean, we depended a lot on our Russian neighbor for that, which is not working very well. We have issues with the circular economy and the race for critical raw materials and for other things. So the focus on security and competitiveness is a lot higher now, which means that in the previous commission, the Green Deal was the rubber stamp of that legislative period and of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. But now it's more competitiveness, security, and also the implementation of the Green Deal. But the implementation is more difficult because we will spend more on defense and security, and the world is more complex and more hostile, and things might happen next week in this country that might complicate things even more. So, I mean, that's the reality. And so they framed an agenda that is much more an economic and security agenda. And that's a difficulty. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was so interesting. I've actually been on like a rabbit hole with the EU Green Deal, and one thing that you pointed out was the 6% emissions that the EU does, but in embodied emissions, we're missing like the carbon flows. And one question about CBAM that I'm kind of like having a lot of discussions about and questioning myself, like, is it really getting to the point? Which, if we look at, like, obviously the EU is also heating up because of the emissions around the world, and they have a lot more emissions, the EU in general, from developing countries that are producing cheaper goods that are being imported into the EU. What are your thoughts on CBAM, and if there's kind of like something missing there to actually address the problem?
Okay, thanks for the numerous questions. No, I'm joking, but you
yeah, there's a lot in
no, but you asked a lot of connected issues. Yeah. First of all, yes, 6% of global emissions. Of course, we have looked also at our external carbon footprint. Yeah, of course, we have looked at the evolution there, and of course, we have looked at per capita or household emissions. And the world is changing very rapidly. What we knew 10 years ago is no longer the case today. Yeah. Still, most people still think that Chinese emissions per capita and per household are a lot lower than European emissions. That's no longer the case. And I'm not here in a blame game. I'm just saying that this is quickly changing, and the external dimension is taken into account in European policies and what we take to the COP and the role we like to play there. But it's an issue, of course. Yeah, that's obvious. The CBAM, I think, is a sincere attempt to address primarily an issue of level playing field, where you want to protect your industries that are doing the right thing against imports that are not in line with your macro policies. And those macro policies are not in essence protectionist. The protectionism is an instrument to protect your macro societal objectives. And it's tricky. There will be at least 200 PhD dissertations written on that. And there are people working day and night on how to make this happen and how to monitor it. It's DG Klima, DG Trade, they're all working on that. But if you would ask me, is this an acceptable way of protecting your objectives and protect, I would say yes. Not in a black and white way, because as a scientist, I hate questions where you have to say yes or no. We try to bring nuance. There is a lot of nuance there, but overall, I would say yes, this is an acceptable way of protecting European industries, at least for a time and with clear thresholds. I think it's acceptable. And let me give you a very clear example. The building industry is based on cement, concrete, and steel, still to a large extent in Europe, less wood than here. Wood and particle board are not our main building components, yeah? So we are working and investing a lot in more carbon neutral steel, less polluting cement and energy. Yeah, it's only logical that there is a sort of protection against imports that are saying, well, we don't care. No, I was gonna show a slide with this shifting.
You can.
Yeah, because the question on okay, it's too complicated. Okay, all right, good. No, that doesn't seem to work. No, it's okay, it doesn't matter. There are several slides in there that show this very rapidly changing evolution of per capita.
Here we go.
Okay, wow, that's amazing. What service? Okay, well, you've seen this, you get the point here. Okay, fantastic. This was not so clear, but that's okay. This went very fast. Okay, climate adaptation, very good. Pupple the pupple the pup. This one I skipped, okay. And then we are where I want to be, and that's here, okay. Household greenhouse gas emissions, yeah, excluding LULUCF. And you have the middle 40%, it's the green dot, yeah. Okay, there are differences, yeah. If you look at the top 1%, look at that, Europe is here, and you look at the bottom 50%, yeah. So there are huge differences, and these things are changing. They're no longer the same, yeah. And if you look at the overall emissions over the last 20 years, you see an increase in some parts of the world, which is the dominant economic model, systems of production and consumption. But we should not fall in the trap of holding the belief that there is somehow a collective global south that is undifferentiated and that still is way below. It's not collective. It's not way below where we are. I mean, a number of countries are, of course, per capita, historically, purchasing power parity since 1990 when we knew, I mean, all of that is true. But there is also a reality that we understand better and better, and which makes it very complicated. Because what are we going to take? The largest emitters? The per capita emissions? Equal per capita rights, that's the essentialists, they claim that. We all have the same innate right to emissions, yeah? Consumption-based emissions, that's your point, yeah? Historic responsibility, my tiny country, Belgium, until not so long ago was a top 10 emitter because we had a big steel and big coal industry. It's all closed down, but yeah. Or responsibility since 1990 when nobody can say we didn't know. No, because you signed the bloody agreement that is called UNFCCC. We started negotiating that in 1990. The capacity to pay, I mean, what are we going to take? And how are you going to put that in an agreement? Yeah. And what if you take this, but you want to take that into account? That's loss and damage. Yeah. Central to the global. He goes, so it's very complicated, which is of course why they need people like you. Yeah. who think logically and analytically and understand the issues and can come with science-based, reasonable solutions. Yeah. Okay, more? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, since we're in Colombia, and I'm not gonna talk about protests. Basically, what lesson can be learned from those kind of policies that we did at the European level into other geographies? Namely, like, what is great and what you think that should be replicated everywhere? For example, the carbon tax,
Yeah.
all economists will be like, this is the most efficient solution. Are you pushing for this to be applicable everywhere?
Yeah.
Is it actually applicable everywhere?
Okay.
And like, what other things that don't work, that should be done better?
Okay, good, great question. Okay, first of all, this is context specific, so copycat, no. Yeah. Secondly, carbon tax, we have a bubble principle. We have a trading system, so it's not a tax system. In fact, when we negotiated the Kyoto Protocol, it was Europe that wanted a tax. The US wanted a market trading system. Europe, in a negotiation, you say, okay, then we'll go with that. And then, of course, it was unanimously defeated in the US Senate. And we ended up with a trading system. And whereas most economists agree that a tax system is simpler and more effective and fast, and voila. So that question is answered with that. What can we learn from this? I don't think so much a particular policy. I think two main things. First of all, this whole European Green Deal was based in solid scientific analysis. Yeah. Every 5 years, Europe writes an SOER, a State and Outlook of the Environment report. And it used to be in the old days, water, air, soil, biodiversity, and we would give the numbers, yeah? But policymakers don't think in ppms and micrograms, yeah? They think in societal issues. So we did a report in 2019 that took more the societal systems as a basis, and we pleaded very strongly for systemic approaches that would make the connections that are embedded in it. On page 1 of the European Green Deal, it says the European Environmental Agency State and Outlook of the Environment report is the scientific knowledge base for the Green Deal. So that's a really strong starting point. So science-based, and then the other thing you could learn from it, I think, is that if you want to know how countries can work together on this, 27 countries are agreeing to this. Sometimes it's a bumpy road and hurdles, and there's a lot of criticism on that, but it's 27 countries. There is no other place on the planet where even 5 other countries work together on 5% of what the EU does with 27 countries. And that makes it a unique political project that has been remarkably stable and successful and attractive, delivering 70 years without wars in the zone of the EU on a continent that had been fighting for centuries. So I think that is a remarkable element. So it's functional minilateralism rather than dysfunctional multilateralism in a way. Yeah. But it's tricky because we often think we're leading, but if nobody is following, you know this, eh? If nobody is following, you're just taking a walk. I mean, yeah, we're not in it. I'm not in this game to take a walk. So that's part of our positioning in global negotiations. And I can tell by my dear colleague Isabel's face that I've spoken way too long, and that is fine. So, voilà, thank you.